Jesus is relating to the people in the synagogue that the prophets of Israel were sent, and who they went to were not the good pious Jews, but to prostitutes and Gentiles. And this kind of upset the folks because they thought that they were the chosen ones. And that's why the people turned so quickly on Jesus, people of his hometown, and wanted to do him in. Just a word of explanation. Lisa Lowitz writes a poem. It's called 30 Skins. She writes, 30 or 40 skins as thick and hard as an ox's or a bear's cover the soul. That's what Meister Eckhart said. What's beneath that hardness? What's piled under years of deceits, selfishness, blame, apathy, ambition, greed? No wonder the skin is hard, resistant to being pulled off. No surprise it rivals the strength of ox, of bear, stubborn armor of ego, all that guarding, all that protecting. On the path of soul, this skin of ignorance can either be shed or ripped off. We have the choice. When we understand the nature of things as they are, the world inside, the world outside, are seen as mere constructs. The world we see before us is what we do to others. Now is the time to strip away your selfishness. Now is the time to be empowered. Now is the time to let the heart be soft, ready to give in, like the parched ground, yielding to each drop of precious rain. We speak of ourselves as spiritual community. A community of 21st century spirituality is the way that I usually put it. And talking of spirituality is good. You know, it tends to make for feel-good kinds of messages. But it also raises questions. What of death? Spirit wants to fly high and be joyous. But what is it that takes us into the deep of who it is that we are? All too often, the answers that Spirit gives are too light and too easy. And it strikes me that too often we're like children playing Monopoly. We just want to go directly to go without risking the pains of jail or the risks of community chess. We talk easily about spirit, but what about soul? What about soul? You know, I was raised during the kind of birth of soul music, and after the kind of what I considered trinkle music of Doris Day singing "Que Sera, Sera" and Pat Boone crooning "A White Sport Coat," soul music kind of burst on the scene, bringing the depth and passion of human experience that was really never portrayed or conveyed by Rock Hudson and his cohorts. Soul music poured out of the passion of rhythm and blues, out of the deep humanity of Ma Rainey and Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker. Lowitz, in her poem, says that the calloused skin that covers soul can either be shed or it can be ripped off. In the case of black blues and soul music, what often cut through our sensibilities that we were hearing the skin being ripped off. The pain of addiction, the pain of unfaithfulness, the hurt of lost love, the grief of untimely death, all cut straight to the heart and laid open our humanness. And you'd think that listening to this music would be depressing and would really be down. But in reality, it was the opposite. It was uplifting. Because here suddenly was the message that here was authenticity in the face of the reality and the realness of life. It was something that broke through and touched the soul. So what is this soul? This aspect of who we are. Thomas More, in Care of the Soul, says it's impossible to define precisely what the soul is. Definition is an intellectual enterprise anyway. We know intuitively the soul has to do with genuineness and depth. James Hillman, a Jungian psychologist, talks of soul being a root metaphor for who we are. He says, by soul, I mean, first of all, a perspective rather than a substance. A viewpoint towards things rather than a thing in and of itself. Personally, I resist saying that soul is a part of us. Because we're whole, complete beings. And I'd rather talk about how soul is an aspect of how we live in the world. Rather than having soul, I'd rather speak of doing soul. That we're souling as a verb. Souling as a word. That soul is a verb. Soul is that animating ground of being that is consistently calling us into the fullness of emotional and instinctual and intellectual and spiritual life. Lowitz says, on the path, this skin of ignorance can either be shed or it can be ripped off. In my own life, I'm afraid that I've never been smart enough or wise enough to shed the skin freely. I sort of have to do it by bashing my head against walls. It's more like it's kind of been ripped off one layer at a time. Maybe I'm a masochist or something, I don't know. Early on in my life, it was being on my own and alone at the age of 16. And then, that touched parts of me. And then after that, it was the death of my grandparents, who were real anchors in my life. And encountering that shed layers of this thick skin that covers the heart and the soul. Especially sitting with my grandmother as she died giving her permission to die, as it were, even while every fiber of my being wanted to hold on to her. You think that now, at my age, that the deep work would be done. Past couple of months, the soul work has been trying to come to terms with torture and abuse by my older brothers when I was quite young. Abuse that has shaped my response to life over the last 60 years. A lot of grief associated with it. And yet, at the same time, liberation, a freeing, a grounding. Brings a sense of clarity, of wholeness never known before. Suddenly things are just a bit clearer. Perspectives are gained. But this is a sense of clarity characterized by a deep groundedness, as old pains are finally buried. Not by the exhilarating flight of joy associated with spirit. There's joy there, but of a different kind. See, I'm convinced that the deep soulfulness of Jesus was also associated with shedding some of the skin and having some of it torn off. When Jesus went into the wilderness after his baptism and experienced temptation, he was choosing to do soul work. He was choosing it. And it wasn't easy. He was choosing essentially what kind of person he was going to be. But then he comes out of that and he goes home. Goes to the synagogue, sitting among friends, and he reads Scripture. And then he starts talking with them. And what's the response? In a flash, they turn on him and want to stone him. I mean, imagine the personal turmoil, the inner response that must have come from that. Experiencing people that you grew up with. Condemning you and wanting to kill you. See, when the skin is ripped off, one of the effects is to open us to the rawness of life in a different way. I'm convinced that when Jesus touched the depth of his soulfulness, that it opened him to see things as they really were. It gave clarity. And as that awareness of the clarity of life seeped into his heart, into the heart of who he was, what came out of that was deep compassion for the world that he was living in. Because he saw it clearly. It was then that this deep compassion was created by the openness to the complexity and wholeness of life. And this is what I think empowered the deep healing that he was able to do in himself and with others. From the willingness to let life touch the heart of who you are. From the willingness to celebrate life's beauty and awesomeness and grieve its pain and hurt simultaneously. In like manner, Siddhartha Buddha, on on his path to the discovery of deep compassion. There was that key experience where he goes out of the palace where his father has protected him all of his life, and he encounters for the first time death and disease and illness and pain and suffering. And the skin starts coming off. Sets him on the path out into the forest and the wilds, where he finally discovered the enlightened way of Buddhism's middle path. See, I think soul is inherent in life, in being. It's that deep essence that is the ground of who we are, that continually strives for completeness and wholeness and healing. When we're born, the seed of who we are sprouts and grows, and there is at that point a connectedness without boundaries that is expansive. But then we grow. And that shoot encounters the vicissitudes of life, and outside forces constrain and crimp and twist and kind of wound us. And we get tamped down and separated from that sense of connectedness and distorted. But always deep within, under the accumulated layers of bare skin, there is that force that, if we let it, feels deeply and seeks primal reconnection. The work of soul, I think, is the work of following the trail of our deep griefs and wounds into the labyrinth of the psyche, so as to foment wholeness and peace within the heart. It's difficult work. And it isn't done alone. Because the primal connection that we are born with is always there, undergirding, supporting, sustaining. And that's why we sing, "Be still, my soul. The powers of creation are on our side. Bear patiently the weight of grief and pain. Leave to God, leave to the universe to order and provide. In every change, God will be faithful, will remain. Be still, my soul. Your eternal connection through the thorniness of life leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul. The powers of creation will undertake to guide in future days as in the past. Your hope, your confidence, let nothing shake. All mysteries shall be clear at last. Be still, my soul. When change and tears are past, all safe and blessed we shall meet. Rumi, the Sufi poet, says, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. This is the essence and the kernel of making soul.